War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, Osowiec Fortress. They walked among the vendor stalls in the market square. They were finding it easier to steal recently. Everyone was distracted with talk of the war. Yuri followed his older brother Sasha as they made their way behind a bread cart. Yuri would keep watch while Sasha crawled under the cart and attempted to reach up to grab a loaf. If it looked like the vendor would look in Sasha's direction, it was Yuri who would distract him. Yuri watched the proprietor of the cart intently while sneaking occasional glances towards the end of the cart, where Sasha's hand was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to rise toward the goal. Thankfully, the man was already preoccupied talking about the war to another man. Yuri guessed that both men were in their late 40s, both way too old to fight in the war. But he listened anyhow, not because he was fascinated, but because by now he had realized that if he took interest in the things that those spoke of, if they happened to notice, they would gladly lecture him about whatever it was they had been speaking. This would give Sasha even more time. Maybe he could grab more than one loaf this time. He was grateful when a small pebble hit his back. That was the signal Sasha would give when he was successful. Yuri's anxiety waned, and he simply turned and walked away from the bread cart. As hungry as Yuri was, he knew better than to ask Sasha for bread immediately. He would have to wait until they decided on a place to sleep that night. They had learned early on in their independence not to flaunt what they had stolen, not to tempt fate. Keep it a secret and stay low, and you stay off the minds of those running carts in the market square. Sasha? He asked. He watched as Sasha stopped and turned around to look at him. Yuri could see the loaf of bread making a lump in his shirt. Yuri lost his train of thought and began to laugh. Sasha looked down at the obvious lump in his shirt. You want to be the one to smuggle the goods, little brother? Sasha asked. Yuri straightened his face. No way. You're better than me at that. Sasha smiled at him now. Exactly. Yuri suddenly remembered why he stopped his brother in the first place. It was going to be dark soon. Where are we going to sleep tonight, Sasha? The night before, they had slept in an alleyway by a church. Would they go back there? Sasha looked up at the sky. Well, it's going to snow, so the alley's no good. Yuri had already thought of that, which was probably why he asked the question in the first place. Sasha continued. We will go to the rail yard tonight. I bet we can find an open car. The two boys had been on their own for 3 years now. Their mother and baby sister hadn't survived the birth, and their father was lost to an accident at the foundry. After that, the small apartment slipped out of reach. The landlord, unmoved by their story, turned them out without a second thought. Since then, the streets of St. Petersburg had become their home. Winters were the hardest, but sometimes they found people willing to let them stay for a few nights, never for long, and never when the weather was mild enough to sleep outside. Tonight, they headed for the rail yard. They had done this before, slipping into an open railcar to sleep. It wasn't without its dangers. Fences to climb and men on patrol who would gladly call the police if they spotted anyone where they shouldn't be. That's why they waited until after dark. They learned to pick their nights. On some evenings, only a few rail cars dotted the yard, too easy to spot a stowaway. But when the place was packed, rail cars stretching out in every direction, there were simply too many for the watchman to check. Those were the nights they counted on. The two boys waited behind a stack of crates near the train station for the sun to go down. They had each eaten some bread, but Sasha wanted to save a good portion for later. He slid the remaining bread into his waistband now that it was dark enough to make their move. Yuri followed his brother to the familiar hole in the fence 3 blocks away. They never waited near the hole in the fence because if they did, then someone may notice the hole and fix it. They never walked the fence line to get to the hole either, for the same reason. They didn't know who made the hole in the fence or how long it had been there, but they were grateful it existed. They had to turn sideways and crouch to squeeze through the narrow gap in the wood. Once inside the yard, they kept to the shadows, searching for a railcar that was unlocked, or, even better, left open. The farther away from the station house and railway offices, the better. It took them about 10 minutes to find one. The car was at the end of a long string of connected cars, just as they hoped. Yuri watched as Sasha carefully slid the heavy door open, then knelt and offered his clasped hands. Yuri stepped forward and placed his foot in Sasha's grip. With a practiced boost, he climbed up into the car. Sasha followed, pulling himself inside and sliding the door almost shut behind them, leaving just a thin crack to see the night outside. Yuri could hardly see anything inside the railcar. The darkness pressed in all around him. He could just make out the shapes of crates stacked high and close together, filling most of the space. Reaching out, he felt along the rough wooden wall, searching for a gap or a corner where he might fit. After a moment, his fingers found a narrow space between two crates, just big enough for him to squeeze into and curl up for the night. He could still see the cracked door from his small space. As his eyes began to close, he could see the snow falling through the gap. The rattling of the railcar woke Yuri. Through the gap left by the partially open door, he could see the landscape sliding past in a blur. The train was moving. Heart pounding, he scrambled to his feet and searched for Sasha. He found his brother curled in a space at the far end of the car, still asleep. Yuri shook his shoulder gently. "Sasha, wake up," he whispered urgently. Sasha cracked open one eye. "What? Yuri, I'm still tired." Yuri couldn't keep the panic out of his voice. "The train, it's moving." For a moment, Sasha didn't react. Then his eyes shot open, wide awake. "Moving?" he repeated, pushing himself up and sliding out of his hiding spot. He hurried to the door, slid it open a little farther, and looked outside. After a moment, he let his head drop and turned back to Yuri. "We aren't even in the city anymore." "Should we jump?" Yuri asked, his voice small. "We could, but we don't know where we are. We don't know how to get back, and we might break our ankles," Sasha replied, shaking his head. Fear tightened in Yuri's chest. "So we just stay here?" "For now, yes." Sasha looked around at the crates stacked in the car. "We don't know where this train is going, but maybe we'll like it once we get there." Sasha's steady tone helped calm Yuri, as it always did. Sasha scanned the railcar again. "Come on, let's see if we can get comfortable somewhere." "How about up there?" Yuri pointed to the top of the stack of crates. "Good idea. We can still see the door and get some fresh air, but we'll be up high in case the car stops and someone comes in." Sasha slid the railcar door a little more closed, leaving just a thin strip of light and air. The two boys climbed up onto the crates. The space between the crate tops and the roof of the railcar was so tight that they had to lie flat on their stomachs. It wasn't comfortable. "Do you think there's food in any of these crates?" Yuri asked quietly. "It's possible. Maybe we can open one later and find out." "Why not look now?" Yuri persisted. Sasha groaned. "Why didn't you suggest that before we climbed up here?" Yuri wriggled around, trying to find a way down. "I'm going to check that one." He pointed at a stack just 3 crates high, easier to reach than the pile of 5 they were on. Sasha just shook his head and watched as Yuri prepared to climb down. Yuri climbed down and crouched beside the highest crate in the stack. It was just a little taller than he was. He ran his fingers along the seams, searching for any weakness. One of the slats near the bottom had a nail that stuck out just a little. He wedged his fingertips underneath and pulled, but the wood barely budged. Glancing around, he spotted a splintered piece of wood on the floor. A leftover from when the crates had been loaded, maybe. He jammed it into the gap and leaned his weight onto it, trying not to make too much noise. The crate groaned and the slats shifted just a little. Encouraged, Yuri kept working, prying and twisting, until finally the end of the board came loose. He peered into the dark gap, heart pounding, hoping for something edible inside. He heard Sasha whisper from above, "What's in it?" It was difficult to see into the crate with the low light that penetrated between the slats of the railcar, but he could see a glint of light bounce off of the contents. "I think it's rifles." Rifles? Yuri heard the shuffle of Sasha now coming down to join him. Then the thud of his feet hitting the floor of the car. Yuri stepped back as far as he could and looked on as Sasha looked through the hole the loose board created. "Whoa!" Sasha exclaimed. "It is rifles." He stood and stepped back the half step. He was now aligned with Yuri, and their backs were against the railcar door. The boys were silent. Yuri's mind narrowed on the only one possible reason for this railcar being loaded with weapons. Finally, he spoke. "Sasha, are we going to war?" He felt the train slow 3 days later. The bread was long gone, and Yuri was starving. The two boys slid atop the crates to a far corner of the railcar, safe, unseen. "When they start to unload, we should be able to find some time to sneak out," Sasha said. "What then?" Yuri asked. Sasha shook his head. "I don't know." The rail car door opened, and the boys watched in horror as a man entered and began inspecting the crates. He started with the crate they had looked in, the one with the rifles, then climbed up to inspect those stacked higher. As he inspected the stacked crates for movement or damage, his eyes locked on Yuri. The man laughed. "Well, what do we have here? Stowaways?" He didn't wait for a response. "Come on, get down now." Yuri followed his brother as they crawled along the crates and dropped down near the door beside the soldier. The man stepped aside, jerking his head for them to go first. As Yuri stepped to the open door, a blast of cold, marshy air hit his face. He blinked, squinting at the strange new world outside. The land beyond the tracks was flat and wild, broken by tangled grass and pools of standing water stretching in all directions. The rails ran across a raised strip of earth, the only dry ground between patches of reeds and thick, sucking mud. In the distance, shrouded in morning mist, a massive structure rose from the marsh like a battered giant. Its low, sloping walls of stone and earth were fringed with tufts of weeds half swallowed by wild grass. Watchtowers and rusted cannons dotted the ramparts, and soldiers in heavy coats moved along the parapets, their shapes blurred by the fog. The whole place looked less like the city's proud buildings and more like an old, wounded animal hunched against the endless plain. Yuri could smell the cold, sour tang of wet earth and hear the far-off croak of frogs. The strange fortress seemed silent except for the shouts of men and the clatter of boots echoing through the mist. It looked nothing like home. It looked like the edge of the world. "What's that?" Yuri asked. "Where are we?" Sasha asked. The soldier looked down at the two boys, then out at the hulking shape in the mist. "Osowiec Fortress," he said. "It's here to hold back the Germans. All this mud and stone, all these guns, meant to keep them from breaking through." He gave a short, tired shrug. "Right now, it's full of soldiers and full of trouble. There's fighting, shelling, and worse. This place," he glanced at the marsh, then back at the fortress, "it's no place for children. You boys caught the wrong train. Come on." He began to lead the boys along the boards through the marshland. More soldiers walked in the opposite direction. Yuri guessed that they were the ones who would actually unload the train. The walls of the fortress loomed larger as they approached. Eventually, Yuri found himself within the walls, looking at a hive of activity. Soldiers drilled, exercised, relaxed, and some even slept in the mud. Yuri stopped in his tracks and looked around. Sasha grabbed his arm. "Come on." They found themselves in a dark, damp office standing before another man who sat behind a desk. "They were on the train?" the man asked the soldier. "Yes, sir, hiding on top of some crates." The man stood, walked around the desk, and leaned on its front. "Tell me, boys, how did this happen?" he asked. Sasha answered, "We needed somewhere to sleep, somewhere out of the snow." "So you chose a rail car?" "Yes, sir." "Well, you chose the wrong car." The man paused and then continued. "What are your names? How old are you boys? Where are your parents?" Sasha spoke for them both. "I am Sasha, and this is my brother Yuri. I am 14 and he is 12. Our parents are dead." "So you have no home?" This time, Yuri found his voice. "We haven't had a home for 3 years. We sleep in alleys and steal food." The man stood up straight and walked back around the desk to sit down. "My name is Colonel Kurtz. This man," he pointed at the soldier who had caught them, "is Major Schmidt. He is our quartermaster here. You see, when we get a new shipment of supplies, he likes to look it over. Take inventory, if you will." Yuri looked at the man he now knew as Schmidt and watched him nod his head in agreement. The colonel continued. "When he brought you in here, my first thought was to send you home to your parents. But you have no parents. So what am I sending you home to?" The boys stayed silent. Sleeping on the street? Begging or stealing food? It was not a question. It was Schmidt that spoke next. "I could always use an assistant, sir." "You have Private Mueller. You have an assistant," the colonel answered. "True, but Mueller can be reassigned to a fighting unit." The colonel sat back in his chair. "That's not a bad idea. Take the older one. Sasha, was it?" Sasha nodded his head in the affirmative. The colonel then focused his attention on Yuri. "Are you fast, son?" Confused by the question, Yuri did not know how to answer. "I think so, sir." The colonel turned his attention back to Schmidt. "You take the older one, I'll take this one. We need a runner." The path to the position he needed to get to was muddier today than normal. The rain had not stopped for the last 2 days. Yuri's boots sank into the mud with each step. He had to wiggle his feet within the oversized boots to make sure they didn't release from his feet and stay there. In the 6 months since they arrived at Osowiec Fortress, he had run up and down each corridor multiple times, each time delivering this message or that. He had also made runs outside the fortress and to the trenches where he heard and saw things that were not meant for boys the age of 12. He thought back to the first time he had been sent outside the fortress. That was 4 months ago now. It had been something the colonel was reluctant to do. However, of the 7 runners he had to relay messages, the other 6 were busy elsewhere. Yuri was all that was left. From within the fortress, he could always hear the sound of artillery and rifle fire. Hearing the cacophony from outside the walls was something he had not been prepared for. He almost ran right back inside, but he knew that he could not do that. The boys were not being paid, but the colonel had given him and Sasha sleeping quarters, had sent for uniforms and shoes, and had been feeding them, so there was no way Yuri could back out, even if he wanted to. He did not feel the fear now like he did that first time. It was still there, but not as paralyzing. And, unlike the first time, he knew that this trip would not take him 3 hours. Not now that he knew where he was going. He took the envelope out of the breast pocket of his yellow-brown khaki uniform jacket and read the name. It was Sergeant Kerensky. Yuri knew exactly where to go. Just ahead, he could see the smoke rising from no man's land, an obvious byproduct of the constant shelling by both sides. The ground beneath him began to slope downwards toward the trench line. A moment later, his boots struck the duckboards that lined the trench floor, rough wooden planks laid down to keep the men from sinking into the mud. Yuri wanted to run the rest of the way to his destination, but the wet boards would be treacherous. They might keep a soldier's feet out of the mud, but they were no good for running. If he tried, he would slip and fall more than once before reaching the proper dugout. Since the sergeant's dugout was in a rear trench about a mile from the fighting, The soldiers Yuri passed were resting, eating, and even laughing as he walked by. For the moment, these men showed no fear. Yuri suspected that changed when they were sent to the front. The sloped path emptied into the trench itself, opening into the main line that stretched away from to the left and to the right like a narrow corridor carved through the earth. He took a right. The trenches were never built in a straight line. If they had been, a single shell landing in the trench could send dirt, splinters, and shrapnel tearing down the entire length without anything to stop it. Before long, he reached a wall of earth that forced him to turn again, first left, then right again farther along. Each short section ran straight for a while before bending sharply once more. He followed the trench through 7 of these turns before reaching the sergeant's dugout. He stepped inside. The sergeant sat behind a rough wooden table. 2 lanterns hung from hooks fastened to the heavy beams overhead, the timbers that held the weight of the earth above the dugout and kept it from collapsing on them. Kerensky looked up. "If it isn't Yuri! Been a while since we've seen you out here." Yuri liked Kerensky. Like most of the soldiers, he was polite to the brothers. Yuri retrieved the letter out of his pocket and laid it on a table. "Everyone else was busy, so they sent me." Kerensky unfolded the letter and began to read it. Yuri waited, just in case he had to run back a response. Kerensky finished reading and tossed the note aside. He looked up at Yuri. "Nothing to send back, kid." Kerensky leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms. "You look like you've grown another inch since the last time I saw you," he said. "Pretty soon they'll have to give you real boots." Yuri looked down at the oversized pair he was wearing now and smiled slightly. "They already tried. These are the small ones." Kerensky chuckled. From somewhere farther down the trench came a dull thump, followed by another. Artillery had been falling all morning, though none of it close enough to concern the men in this rear line. Kerensky reached for a tin cup sitting on the table and took a drink. "You heading back already?" he said. Yuri nodded. If there's no reply, Kerensky waved a hand toward the trench entrance. "All right. Don't let me keep you. Let the colonel know that we are still here." Yuri turned and backed out of the dugout. The trench outside looked much the same as when he had arrived. A few soldiers sat along the duckboards with their backs against the earthen walls. One of them was cutting a piece of bread with a pocket knife while another cleaned mud from the bolt of his rifle. They barely looked up as Yuri passed. He entered the fortress. He had a choice. Go back to the colonel and see if there was another message to run, or go to the basement and see Sasha. He chose the basement. Sasha was positioned in a chair in the corner of the room. He was alone. This happened a lot. Most of the men at the front had what they needed. Sasha was just there to keep the room occupied and keep an eye on the material stored there. Yuri was always amazed at just how much stuff the military had. Along one wall there was shelving with neatly folded uniforms along with bedrolls and socks. Along another wall was more shelving with what looked like food items. And in a corner was a door. Behind that door, Yuri knew, was the rifles, ammunition, and grenades, weapons of destruction. "What are you doing here, little brother?" Sasha asked as he walked in. "I just came back from running a message. Thought I would come see you," Yuri responded. "And if the colonel needs you again?" "He knows I come here. He'll send someone for me. You know this." "True." Sasha stood, walked across the room, and embraced his brother. When the embrace broke, he asked, "Anything interesting going on out there?" "Just the usual. Guys sitting around waiting to go to the forward trench." "Remember when we got here? How scared we were that it was going to be constant danger, Yuri?" "Yeah, but instead it's been pretty boring." Yuri could see his brother contemplate something. "I never thought war could be boring." A commotion just outside the door to the storage room caught their attention, and they both looked towards the door. The door crashed open, and a man stumbled in. He collapsed instantly on the floor. Yuri watched as Sasha sprang into action. He ran to the man, and somehow, despite his small frame, was able to turn the man onto his back. He stood and jumped back in shock at the sight. My God, what happened? Sasha asked. Yuri walked forward and looked down at the man. He was obviously dead. His face was a gray-blue color, his eyes a shiny color of red the boys had never seen before. His uniform front was covered in blood and another substance. It looked like mucus. Two more men ran through the door. It was then that Yuri could hear the screaming and commotion from the upper level of the fort. Both men were holding fabric to their faces, fabric ripped from the arms of their own uniforms, it looked like. Both were coughing, their eyes red. The first man did not even address the boys. He ran towards the weapons storage store. Hey, if you need something, we need to check it out, Sasha yelled. The second man had followed the first. We don't have time. They're coming. Yuri could hear the panic in the man's voice. More men arrived. One stopped and looked down at the dead man. Oh, God, that's going to be all of us. His voice was tinged with panic. Yuri began to feel it now. The fear. He learned right then and there that panic was contagious. Sasha grabbed his brother by the arm. I don't know what's going on, but there's no way I can stop these guys, so don't try. I wasn't going to, replied Yuri. I'm not a quartermaster's assistant, you are. He glanced around at the men again. All of them had the same strange blue-gray color to their faces. They all coughed, and the front of their uniforms were covered in blood and mucus. But they were all grabbing weapons, grenades, and ammunition and running back out of the room. There must have been at least 30 men that came through in a 5-minute span. As the last man exited the room and began to run up the stairs to the ground level, Yuri found himself following. The stairs led to a courtyard that was just within the walls of the fortress. Scattered around the courtyard, he could see bodies, men with the same blue-gray skin, some motionless, some choking, coughing, spitting up blood and mucus. Near the main entrance to the fortress, the gate that Yuri took many times to deliver messages to the rear position, stood the 30 or so men that had just raided the armory. They were all animated, in deep discussion. Yuri saw a doctor tending to a man on the ground. What's going on? I'm scared, Yuri asked. The doctor, who was down on one knee, looked up at him. You need to go to the basement, and you need to stay there. But what happened? Yuri asked again. Gas attack, the doctor said dismissively. What does that mean? Yuri asked. The doctor looked at the main entrance to the fort as it opened and the men began to exit towards whatever was out there. The doctor pointed towards and out the entrance. That. Yuri's eyes widened. From outside the door, in the distance, there was a green cloud clinging to the ground. It seemed to move slowly, but also be stationary at the same time. The doctor stood. He was next to Yuri now. That's poison gas. The Germans seem to have a new weapon. Yuri looked up at him and then back at the men who were still running through the gate. And those men? He asked. Those men? The doctor paused. Those men are already dead.
You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.